Fellow citizens of the United States, in compliance with a custom as old as the government itself, I appear before you to address you briefly and to take, in your presence, the oath prescribed by the Constitution of the United States to be taken by the President before he enters on the execution of his office. Apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the accession of a Republican administration, their property and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. Indeed, the most ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and been open to their inspection. It is found in nearly all the published speeches of him who now addresses you. I do but quote from one of those speeches when I declare that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. Those who nominated and elected me did so with full knowledge that I had made this and many similar declarations and had never recanted them. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it.
How did it come to this, that a duly elected American president should plead with his fellow citizens to not become the aggressors? When did the American experiment go so far awry that half the nation sat poised on the edge of violent insurrection? How far back can we trace this schism in our own self-identity, in which we were a beacon of liberty to the world, yet drove millions of slaves to toil beneath the lash? Slavery in America was older than the nation itself, born among the colonies of European nations. During the lead-up to the American Revolution, Jefferson and others criticized Britain for creating slavery in the colonies. The new Constitution denigrated slaves with its 3/5 clause by counting each as less than a whole person. But it also set an end date for the international trade in slaves. And in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, the Congress had sectioned off an enormous territory and declared that this portion of land should be forever free. Things changed with the invention of the cotton gin. Eli Whitney's invention didn't take all of the intense labor out of cotton. It removed the time-consuming bottleneck of combing cotton, which meant that now cotton plantations could process enormous amounts of cotton far more quickly than ever before. Which meant that those plantations needed to get more cotton out of the fields faster. And to do that cheaply, they needed slaves. The growth in slavery driven by cotton changed slavery from a British-created institution that Thomas Jefferson could claim had been forced upon the colonies into a truly American engine of industry. By 1850, about 75% of American slaves were in the service of King Cotton.
Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away.
Paralleling the rise of cotton was the growth of the abolitionists. Initially, the abolitionist movement was limited to Quakers, who persuaded members to give up their slaves. Following the American Revolution, the movement grew, with more and more people calling for the end of slavery. In the years leading up to the Civil War, abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass insisted that, over time, former slaves and their progeny would become assimilated into American society. Against the flood of abolitionists, there stood a wall of Southern planters and their representatives in the Congress and the Senate. South Carolina Senator James Henry Hammond, who crowned Cotton King, and before him, South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun were among the most prominent voices. In the 1830s and 40s, Calhoun led the pro-slavery faction in the Senate. He directly opposed abolitionism and was a major advocate of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. Calhoun is perhaps most famous, or infamous, for his 1837 speech on the Senate floor in which he described slavery not as a necessary evil, but as a positive good.
Abolition and the Union cannot coexist. As the friend of the Union, I openly proclaim it, and the sooner it is known, the better. We of the South will not, cannot surrender our institutions. To maintain the existing relations between the two races inhabiting that section of the Union is indispensable to the peace and happiness of both. The relation now existing in the slave-holding states between the two races is, instead of an evil, a good, a positive good.
In 1850, Calhoun was a major supporter of the Fugitive Slave Act. This new law would serve to galvanize opponents of slavery, driving the wedge between North and South even deeper. The original Fugitive Slave Act in 1793 had made it illegal to give aid to runaway slaves. However, that law left responsibility for enforcement to the states. Under the new law, however, all fugitive slave cases would be handled by federal officials. Not surprisingly, it is believed that many free blacks were caught up in this act, captured by agents working for Southern planters and unable to offer a word in their own defense. Also, unsurprisingly, this law outraged abolitionists such as Harriet Beecher Stowe. Stowe was infuriated, believing the law sought to make her complicit in an immoral system. Her sister-in-law, Isabella Porter Beecher, wrote to Stowe, "If I could use a pen like you, Hattie, I would write something that would show the entire world what an accursed thing slavery is." Stowe, already a writer, resolved to do just that. The result was successful beyond anyone's expectations. Written in 1851 as a serial story published in the anti-slavery newspaper, The National Era, Uncle Tom's Cabin was collected and sold as a book in 1852. It sold 300,000 copies within a year and 2 million in 2 years. Telling the story of slaves suffering under, escaping from, and dying in slavery, Stowe's book spread her own outrage into the hearts and minds of millions of readers. The dividing line between North and South grew ever sharper, and it was drawn on the issue of slavery. As the U.S. gained more and more territory, expanding westward according to its manifest destiny, disagreements became arguments. Arguments became fights. Fights became battles. And eventually, battles became war. Introduced by Democratic Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 changed the rules for determining whether a territory would be slave or free. Under the concept known as popular sovereignty, the residents of each territory would get to vote to decide whether slavery would be permitted. That is, the white male residents would get to vote on whether peoples other than themselves could be enslaved. The act specifically repealed that part of the Missouri Compromise that outlawed slavery north of the line drawn in 1820. Stephen Douglas hoped that this would win him the support of Southerners. His eye was on an eventual bid for the presidency. But he did not consider the degree of opposition the bill would face in the North. In particular, he had no inkling of the future of one man in particular who would be energized by this act: Abraham Lincoln.
I was losing interest in politics when the repeal of the Missouri Compromise aroused me again.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act was the impetus for the first round of the Lincoln-Douglas debates that launched Lincoln's national political career and carved out his views on slavery.
I think, and shall try to show, that it is wrong. Wrong in its direct effect, letting slavery into Kansas and Nebraska, and wrong in its prospective principle, allowing it to spread to every other part of the wide world where men can be found inclined to take it. This declared indifference for the spread of slavery I cannot but hate. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites, causes the real friends of freedom to doubt our sincerity, and especially because it forces so many really good men amongst ourselves into an open war with the very fundamental principles of civil liberty, criticizing the Declaration of Independence and insisting that there is no right principle of action but self-interest.
Despite the opposition of Lincoln and many others, the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, signed into law on May 30th, 1854. The question of slavery in each territory would be determined by the vote of the people living there. And so the stage was set for the most strident, short-tempered, zealous, and potentially violent proponents of both slavery and abolition to marshal their forces and run to Kansas to swell the ranks of voters for their side in hopes of winning the state. Pro-slavery settlers moved in from Missouri, with some showing up just long enough to vote. Meanwhile, abolitionist societies back east were funding settlers to add their anti-slavery votes. Thousands of pro- and anti-slavery men and families moved to Kansas, planning to wage war at the ballot box, but also armed for a more physical confrontation. Tensions rose, and political chicanery became open violence. On May 21st, 1856, a group of about 800 border ruffians entered the town of Lawrence, Kansas, which was under the control of Free State settlers. They blocked off all roads out of town, preventing escape. Under a flag inscribed "Southern Rights," they smashed the printing presses in the town's 2 printing offices and threw the type into the river. They then set fire to the Free State Hotel. Hundreds more would be killed in the War of Bushwhackers in Kansas. But in 1859, Free Soilers were able to elect a majority of the delegates to the territory's Constitutional Convention, and in January 1861, Kansas was admitted as a free state. Less than a year after these incidents in Kansas, the issue of Congress setting aside territories as being slave or free rose again. The case was Dred Scott versus Sanford, in which the court further declared that persons of African descent, slave or free, were not citizens of the United States. Scott sued for his freedom in 1846. The case wound its way through courts over the years, finally landing in the U.S. Supreme Court in 1856, whose members included 5 slaveholders. Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote the majority opinion, declaring that Dred Scott and all persons of African descent could not be citizens of the United States, even if they were recognized as citizens of an individual state. Therefore, Scott could not sue in federal court, and the Supreme Court had no jurisdiction over the case. The immediate consequence of the decision was that Dred Scott and his family failed to secure their freedom in court. As Lincoln said in his House Divided speech in 1858,
"Such a decision is all that slavery now lacks of being alike lawful in all the states. Such decision is probably coming and will soon be upon us unless the power of the present political dynasty shall be met and overthrown."
In that same speech, Lincoln foresaw the coming Civil War.
"A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south."
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.